everything you hear is de-escalation, right? You know, we need to de-escalate. We need to lower the temperature. This mantra of de-escalation essentially has given Iran the license to escalate on their own terms with impunity. And let me know where you're coming from and a little bit about yourself, too.
Morning, sir. My name is Grant Warnick, and I'm coming from Duke University.
Oh, the evil ones. I
Sold
went
my
to
soul to go
Chapel
there.
Hill for grad school. But we had a crossover program with Duke, though. It was fantastic, you know. And one of my classmates from that period, Wayne Lee, was a Duke PhD and now runs God, what is it called? What's the War Studies program at UNC
Peace
Chapel
War
Hill?
Studies at UNC. It's a great program.
Yeah.
I actually also just graduated from Marines Officer Candidate School on Saturday. And while we were there, we were forbidden from asking about Force Design 2030 to either our platoon commander or our company commander. That was off limits. So I wanted to ask you, because it is a very controversial strategic document. You've had every former living commandant come out and criticize it when General Berger started working on it. So was interested to hear your thoughts on it.
Okay, here's what I'd like to do is just talk to you about, let me see if I can go back. Is there a way to go back? Yeah. Okay. I think that document is flawed because it's based on unrealistic assumptions about future war. And you know, I mentioned how this revolution in military affairs orthodoxy was a setup in the 90s. It's really a new version of strategic bombing theory appears about every decade and a half, right? And essentially the argument associated with this new version of strategic bombing theory is that future war really is going to be different. It can be waged at standoff range, right? It's going to be clean and cheaper, and we just have to be niftier, right? So if you read the Obama administration's defense strategy, it talks about integrated deterrence. I mean, you could just substitute pixie dust, I think, for integrated deterrence, and that's really the argument that they're making. I think what the war in Ukraine has really highlighted once again to us is hard power really matters. And hard power means really you have joint forces, which means forces that operate across all the services, but in all the domains of land, sea, aerospace, space, cyberspace, and can integrate those capabilities in joint forces to defeat the enemy and to accomplish your objectives, which in Ukraine really, for the Ukrainians, is to eject the Russians and to regain control of their territory, populations, and resources in their country and be able to defend against future threats. Think about the way that we try to deter the Russians, right? We declassified some intelligence. That was kind of nifty, you know? We threatened them with economic sanctions, also kind of nifty. You know, we took all these actions. It didn't make a difference, right? What matters is capable joint forces that can operate in sufficient scale and for ample duration to win, right? That's how you deter war. And our investments in defense have been paltry. And in this vision for the Marine Corps in 2030, it's based on flawed assumptions. Now, I think I chucked this in here in case it was relevant, and thanks for the question. But I think that the assumption that the Marine Corps is making is that future war will be in the realm of relative certainty, because that's one of the assumptions you make if you're going to think you can wage war at standoff range, because your surveillance capabilities, your various ways of collection, your big data analytics will be able to target the enemy at long range. And what the Marine Corps has done is they have divested themselves from a lot of close combat capabilities for these longer range capabilities. Fewer infantry, no tanks, and very little artillery, right, is what's left in the Marine Corps. I believe that war is evolving in a way that will make close combat with the enemy even more important and decisive. And that's because we are seeing the countermeasures to these longer range capabilities. There are some traditional ones: dispersion, concealment, intermingling with civilian populations, and deception. But there increasingly are technological countermeasures. counter-satellite capabilities, offensive cyber capabilities, electromagnetic warfare, tiered and layered air defense. Right now, it seems like drones are decisive, but there are about 30,000 drones being destroyed, every few months in Ukraine. So war is this continuous interaction of opposites, as I mentioned, within wars, but also between wars in the development of combat capabilities. So you have the machine gun. Remember the machine gun was decisive? But then you have the tank, so maybe it's not that decisive. But then you have the anti-tank missile, so the tank isn't everything. But then you have the submarine, the sonar, the bomber, the radar, right? You have our exquisite precision strike capabilities, but then all these countermeasures that I mentioned. So how you think about future war is really important. Do you believe that future war, this is the fundamental assumption, will lie in the realm of certainty or uncertainty? And if anybody's super bored, or has a sleeping disorder and needs to, make sure you get to sleep, you can read a monograph I wrote when I was a National Security Affairs Fellow here, 2002 to 2003, called Cracking the Foundation, Defense Transformation and the Underlying Assumption of Dominant Knowledge in Future War. And so in 2002, I was challenging this orthodoxy, but it's come back. I call it the vampire fallacy. You can't kill it, man. It always comes back. So I think the Marine Corps is putting itself at a severe disadvantage in close combat competency in future war, and that's going to really be painful for the Marine Corps to relearn, what it needs to conduct combined arms operations in close contact with the enemy. Okay.
Hi, my name's Ariana. I'm from Williams College. So across the past decade, a lot of countries have been nuclearizing, you mentioned that, and different countries have been taking different nuclear postures along with that. For example, India has had a no-first-use nuclear policy. China, in contrast, has been, China has had a no-first-use nuclear policy as well. But India has been considering shifting that, and I was wondering if you could possibly give us an example of how India would consider, with these strategic steps that you spoke of, how India would consider shifting its policy. Yeah. And my second question is, in a nuclearizing age, as new countries come in and take on the nuclear stage, is America's strategy and posture in the nuclear world going to be functional in the future? Thank you.
Okay. So I think you have to begin from India's perspective, looking at its security situation. And of course, they're surrounded by, by a very large neighbor to the north, China, that's nuclear armed, and a hostile Pakistan, which is also nuclear armed. So I think from the Indian perspective, you have to think about how does our doctrine relate to really what you want to achieve, which is to deter attacks on India. And I think that has to do with really thinking about what are China's designs, how would you deter China. Remember, it's kind of top of mind for them because China was bludgeoning Indian soldiers to death on the Himalayan frontier just a couple of years ago. And of course, after the Mumbai attacks, which are only the most dramatic in recent years of Pakistan's continued use of terrorist organizations as an arm of their foreign policy and as a means to attack India. So I think India, if it forgoes or revises the no first use, it'll be because it feels that that's the best way to deter a conflict. For the United States, I think that we were really asleep for a long time in terms of nuclear deterrence, especially during the Obama years. Our strategic forces atrophied considerably in terms of even just modernization, the development of new capabilities, and even just refurbishing the existing capabilities. A lot of that had been based on the idea that the Cold War was over, and these assumptions in the 1990s. I really didn't talk about this very much, but there were three assumptions I think in the 1990s. One of them I mentioned to you, which is the idea that future war would be fast, cheap, efficient. Our technological military prowess would guarantee our security well into the future. But the other assumptions were that great power rivalry was a relic of the past, and ideological competition was over. And of course, what we've seen with Russia and with Putin, the way he's been rattling his nuclear saber recently, is that we may not have the full range of capabilities that we need to deter Russia from applying this doctrine of what Putin has talked about, which is escalation domination or escalate to de-escalate. And essentially what Putin has said publicly is that we could use a tactical nuclear weapon against a European city, and then posed the United States with this question: okay, what are you going to do? Are you going to sue for peace on our terms, or are you going to choose nuclear Armageddon? So what we did in the Trump administration, and you can read this document, it's an open source document from early 2018 under the Nuclear Posture Review, is we said we need a greater range of nuclear capabilities to be able to deter Russia from employing this doctrine of escalation domination. We also noted in that document, which was significant, is that China was in a race already and has really accelerated its race to increase its nuclear arsenal by really 400% is really what they're doing at the moment. And we were involved in treaties with Russia when that was our only really concern, and the Soviet Union before it, that were now irrelevant because of what China was doing. And by the way, Russia was violating those treaties. I'm talking in particular about the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, the INF Treaty. And we also got out of that treaty because it was a fantasy, and we needed the longer range capabilities. The Biden administration has stopped some of the modernization efforts and cut funding for it. And I think if there is a Trump administration, that'll be restored. But I forget what the numbers are. If anybody knows, if somebody can just look it up. I mean, how many tactical nuclear weapons does Russia have compared to the United States? It's something crazy. Like we have like 100, and they have, 5,000 or something like that. So I think there are elements of deterrence also that we tried to address in the Nuclear Posture Review. One of those, which was controversial but I think made total sense, is we said in the Nuclear Posture Review that we could interpret an attack, a massive cyber attack against our communication system as a precursor to a first strike and respond accordingly. So that was a message to China that if you try to take down our infrastructure, we could respond with nuclear force from the beginning under the idea that maybe what you're trying to do is set conditions for a successful first strike. And I believe China's trying to get a first strike capability right now. We can talk more about that if you want. Okay, yes.
Hi, thank you.
We'll keep moving the mics closer to the top. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. My name is Nathan, and I'm a junior at the University of Texas. And at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that you believe that there is a decent probability of a world war sometime in the near future with the powers of China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea working together. But many would also say that these countries have lots of opposing interests and wouldn't be able to work together despite their common interest of ousting Americans from their spheres of power. But at the same time, there are lots of examples in history of powers with opposing interests working together. So my question for you is, what are the criteria you think that allow countries that butt together on so many issues to come together militarily? And why do you believe that those 4 countries have that ability?
Yeah. Well, I think that they see that they can fulfill each other's needs, right? So you have Iran, for example, that is trying to circumvent the sanctions regime, that also needs some technical expertise for its missile programs. And you have China, who needs Iran's oil and gas, for example. But also you have this overall idea that's bringing them together, rather than go specifics, that the world is chaotic, that the world is on the brink of maybe a cataclysmic war. But Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping believe that is in their interest. They have said so, right? I mean, if you look at the last summit that they had together, or maybe it's 2 summits ago, Xi Jinping said something like, there's one word for what's happening in the world, and it's chaos. And he said to Vladimir, and I think this is working in our favor, right? And so I think that there is this overall drive to really destroy the international order or the rules of international discourse from an economic perspective, from a diplomatic perspective, the redefinition of human rights, for example. You have the infiltration and subversion of international organizations in a way to turn them against their purpose. The Human Rights Council, for example, or the World Health Organization, for example. And I think that they see the subversion of these international organizations and the pursuit of even more chaos and disruption as actually redounding to their benefit. I think what happens is when we try to divide them, right, and this is the idea of kind of resurrecting the triangular diplomacy of the Nixon of the Nixon administration, in which we endeavored, in the context of the Cold War, to have a closer relationship both with Moscow and Beijing than they had with one another. And therefore, we could divide them, and we could prevent what the great geostrategic theorists have told us, Spikeman and others, that we should, from the perspective of the UK in the late 19th century, is that you don't want a hostile power to dominate the world island of the Eurasian landmass. So it made geostrategic sense to try to separate them. But I don't think that applies anymore. I think when we pretend like they're separate, when we humiliate ourselves by saying, oh, we're going to talk to Beijing and ask them to get Iran to moderate its behavior, I mean, really? You think that's going to work? I think what we allow them to do is to cover for one another. We allow China to act like it's calling on all parties to de-escalate, when in fact it's really materially supporting Iran's threat network of terrorists and militias across the Middle East. When we think that, well, maybe Russia can moderate, the Iranians in Syria, for example. This is Putin's Potemkin peace plan for the Middle East, in which he says, hey, support Assad staying in power, and what I'll do is I will work to lessen Iranian influence in a post-Civil War Syria. That's all a lie, right? So we should stop pretending. I think instead of trying to separate them, we should glue them together, not only because they deserve each other, but we should hang what they're doing around their necks like lodestones. The Ukraine war, for example, and China's support, very material support for Russia in its continuation of its onslaught against the Ukrainian people. We should hang that around China's neck, I believe.
Hello, Lieutenant General.
Yeah.
My name is Thomas Bolin. My question for you today is about what we've seen in Ukraine the past week or so, specifically their offensive into the Kursk region. Do you think that we will see more initiatives like those, or do you think that Ukraine will go back to trying to bolster their front lines and defend the territory that they have right now?
Yeah, I think you could see more of these kinds of attacks that have relatively limited objectives, because what this has done is it has alleviated pressure on the Eastern Front for the Ukrainians. I think that was one of the purposes of the attack. But another purpose of the attack was to get outside of, from a different angle, this is what I believe, just from looking at the map, and I've not heard any analysts say this, to get outside of their tiered and layered air defense capabilities and be able to employ long-range assets against the airfields and long-range strike capabilities that Russia's been using with devastating effect against the Ukrainians. I mean, are the Russians going to use glide bombs now on their own soil? Probably not. So one of the biggest advantages that the Russians have had is now kind of off the table. Are the Russians going to try to marshal forces to regain that territory and impale themselves on what are likely to be, prepared defenses, with capabilities like Javelin missiles and so forth? I don't know. I mean, but it could be very costly for the Russians to do this. So what you've seen with this attack is an effort to regain the initiative, which is what you always want in combat, in war, is you want your enemy responding to you rather than the other way around. You want to dictate the terms of battle. So I think it is extremely effective. I think the Russians appear strong in some ways, right, because they can mobilize more people. They have a great deal of firepower that they can bring to bear, especially from a relative perspective. Ukraine has less manpower. Ukraine was struggling with munitions because of the long pause in our support for them with munitions and weapon systems. So that's Russia's strength. What is Ukraine's strength now? Ukraine has struck at weakness, which you always want to do in combat. Don't impale yourself on strength. Go with weakness. And I think they must have learned, from the Prigozhin. Remember the Wagner Group, attack on Moscow. Okay, this is like an ex-hot dog salesman, an ex-con, took a bunch of other ex-cons, took over the equivalent of U.S. CENTCOM headquarters, right, and then marched on Moscow, shot down 7 aircraft, right? I mean, that didn't look like strength to me. So Putin appears strong, but actually I think his regime is quite brittle. Now, I don't know, you had Kockin yesterday, right? Is he, Stephen Kockin, is he the best, So I'll use my Kockin impression, right? Okay, it's really important to understand, right, that authoritarian regimes don't have to be that strong. They just have to be stronger than the organized opposition. Did I do okay? All right. He's the best. I love that guy. So you know, but I think what it does is it exposes the weakness for Russia, right? The more Putin talks about it, the more embarrassing it is for him, right? You know, so I think it was a brilliant move, actually. It's not going to be decisive, but I likened it in an interview a few days ago to Washington crossing the Delaware and the defeat of the British and Hessian forces at Trenton and Princeton, right? It didn't win the war, right? There were still, 5 years of war to go. But it did it changed the perspective that we had lost the initiative completely after the defeat in New York. Yes.
Thank you so much. Oh, go ahead.
I'll take two. Well, let's do two in a row. Do two in a row. If I can remember it, I'm over 60, man. You might have to help me. I'm like, what was that first question again? Okay, go ahead.
Good morning, sir. My name is Josh, and I'm a first-class cadet at the Air Force Academy. So I just have a quick question for you. So you had the unique ability to serve as an active duty officer in a traditionally civilian capacity as the National Security Advisor. Could you speak to the CivMil dynamic and the dynamic between yourself and the combatant commanders?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, okay, what was your question? Together?
All right. Thank you so much for talking. Really appreciate it. I'm Jaden Stewart. I go to Princeton University. You spoke earlier about the danger of making assumptions in foreign policy. I think one of the longest standing assumptions that we've made is that our allies would support our efforts internationally efficiently and pay their fair share in terms of providing support in terms of our efforts abroad. So how do you think we can better counteract that and ensure that our allies are able to effectively contribute to our efforts abroad?
Okay. All right, great. So, hey, serving as National Security Advisor, it wasn't unprecedented for me to stay active duty. Colin Powell had done that. Actually, Brent Scowcroft had done it as well as a Deputy National Security Advisor. Then he transitioned to civilian when he came back into that job under a different administration. But, I think there was really no conflict at all from my perspective. Now people would want to try to make something of it. President Trump asked me to stay on active duty. I wanted to stay on active duty. But I told him, and I told Secretary Mattis also, who I think you talked with Cocken yesterday, that, hey, I decided when I took the job that I would retire out of that job whenever I was used up, whenever my time was up. I tell this story in some detail in my forthcoming book, which will be out next week, called At War with Ourselves, not to plug it, but it is, there's still some beach reading time available, and I'm telling you, it's a page turner. It's a page turner. So, but in it, I try to explain this in greater depth. This question. There were practical implications for me. I went to interview for the job at Mar-a-Lago on a Sunday over President's Day weekend. I'd received a call on Friday. My job at the time was to develop the future Army, as a 3-star general. So I flew down to Mar-a-Lago. I had the first interview on Sunday. The president held me till the end of the day, that first day, and then ran out of time for a second interview. And I was part of the down select, between two of us for an interview on Monday. I didn't know who that was, the other candidate was, until I ran into Ambassador Bolton in the men's room on my way in. They were trying to give a separate, Ambassador General. So he was on his way out. I came in. And the president said, hey, I'm not going to do a second interview with you. You're hired. I flew back with him on Air Force One. I didn't live in Washington, so they had aircraft waiting for me, Marine Corps Osprey aircraft, to fly me back to my house in Tidewater, Virginia, pack a bag, and I started work on Tuesday, And so if I had gotten out of the Army, that would have really delayed so much. And the Army took care of me. They got me a house on Fort McNair. So it eased my transition was one thing. But also, I didn't see any conflict at all. When there was when people would criticize, guy, he shouldn't be in uniform, it was typically when I was making statements of policy, of administration policy, which I didn't see in any way, infringing on my military professionalism or ability to stay above partisan politics. I think actually it was a tremendous advantage to stay above partisan politics. Like I would never go to like a political rally with President Trump. I never did that. I never did anything explicitly political, but I did work on helping him understand his foreign policy agenda, make decisions, put in place what I believe were long overdue correctives to unwise policies. And I had no problem describing those, and communicating those to the relevant audiences. I would have preferred not to be on television that much doing it, but when you have secretaries of state, defense, and others who don't want to go on Sunday television, it kind of defaulted to me a lot of times, So Anyway, so I really didn't see a conflict in it at all, and I think I could see it again where I think a military officer could fulfill that position well. And then on allies and partners, I think what you have to do is you have to map interests, and understand where those interests overlap and where they diverge, and then manage those relationships in a way where you try to incentivize the actions that you want these allies and partners to take. They're just not automatically going to go along with you. But also I think with allies and partners, it's really important to do this kind of framing of these challenges, like I mentioned, to pose questions to them. Hey, how can we work together to help stabilize Iraq and ensure Iraq is not aligned with Iran? How can we work together to make some kind of progress toward a resolution of the Syrian conflict while ensuring the enduring defeat of ISIS and limiting Iran's and Russia's influence in a post-Civil War Syria, right? Ask those questions before you say, oh, here's the U.S. policy. I need you to sign up for this. And so one of the things that I did as National Security Advisor is I convened the Quint Forum, which is the UK, the US, Germany, Italy, and France, under the idea that all of us had certain different competitive advantages, and we could work with other partners internationally around an agreed approach to some of our first-order problems. And it was like the third full day on the job. I did a video telephone conference with them, and I said, hey, I'm the new member of the club here, what advice do you have for me? I think that shocked them, because usually they're used to Americans just talking and telling them what they think. What are your biggest challenges? I took notes, and I said, hey, I've got an idea. What if we work on these five? We take the top 5 of our big challenges to our security and prosperity and so forth, and we assign one to each of us to be the lead, and we convene kind of a policy coordinating committee across our 5 countries, with each of us taking the lead in this, and we frame out a multinational strategy to address that challenge. And we inventory kind of our relative competitive advantages, and this is going to be a very high-level strategy, and we did that, and then we actually implemented that approach, and we kept track of where each of our leaders were. So if Chancellor Merkel was meeting with the Sultan of Turkey, Erdogan, I would send like a one-pager, hey, it'd be great if she could make these points. This is the points that President Trump made. And we would we actually implemented together, too. A lot of times, people think meetings are planning. They're not. They're not. You got to break the meeting culture and have a planning culture where you bring people together and you work together to identify opportunities to advance your interests, rather than brief each other and then call it a day and go back to doing things as usual.
Thank you for your talk. My name is Aditi, and I'm a medical student from King's College London.
Great.
I had the pleasure to sit with Professor Kotkin yesterday at lunch, and he was mentioning the difference between winning the war and winning the peace. So, for example, he gave, in Afghanistan, we won the war, but we did not win the peace. Or in Vietnam, we lost the war, but won the peace that Vietnam is now an ally to the US. Okay. So I wanted
kind of an ally, still communist dictatorship, but okay.
So I wanted to understand your perspective on what he was saying, and how can we use the military to not only win the war, but win the peace as well?
Yeah,
Thank you.
okay, great. It's a great question. There's a great book by one of our colleagues here at Hoover, Nadia Shadlow. It's called War and the Art of Governance. I highly recommend it. And in it, she talks about American denial syndrome, in which we always deny that, hey, this is a part of war, is consolidating gains, getting to sustainable political outcomes. And I think what you had after Vietnam is what I would call the Vietnam syndrome. And the Vietnam syndrome, there's a great essay by Conrad Crane on this, by the way, was that, hey, we're just never going to do that again. We're never going to have to fight a war that's complicated. And we can fight just these kind of really sharp military engagements, whether it's the Panama invasion or Desert Storm, and we're just not going to do that again. And there was a generation of officers that were influenced by that kind of thinking, this is not consolidation is not an integral part of war, but of course it always has been. And give you so many examples, right? Panama is one of those examples, right? Dominican Republic in 1965 is an example. Smaller scale examples. How about South Korea? Everybody thought that was going to be a failed state even after 1953 and the end of the war. World War II. There had to be a consolidation of gains to get to political outcomes. So, I'd say, first of all, you have to acknowledge that that's part of war. I argue in the book Battlegrounds that the difficulties that we encountered in both Afghanistan and Iraq were due in large measure to us taking a short-term approach to what were long-term problems there. And our short-term approach and our desire to disengage actually lengthened those wars and made them more costly. The Afghanistan example, I think, is an important one to look at, but not for the reasons maybe that Professor Cocken mentioned. I might have a different perspective on this. I think what Afghanistan was a self-defeat, that we had already won the war in Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan had not become Denmark, right? It's not going to ever be Denmark. It's going to be Afghanistan, and it would be violent, but we weren't fighting anymore. We were enabling an Afghan force that was now taking kind of a sustainable level of casualties, unlike it was in 2016, 17, when we changed the strategy. And we were knocking the hell out of the Taliban in 2018 into 2019. Then we reversed that strategy, a strategy that I believe was working at a sustainable level. Would have cost about $22 billion a year. Think about how many billions of dollars of equipment we just left there. Think about what the cost has been to build like an over-the-horizon counterterrorism center in Qatar for $20 billion. I mean, that's not effective, by the way. And we had a force that was fighting with us on a modern-day frontier between barbarism and civilization against these jihadist terrorist organizations. And we were having a huge impact from a humanitarian perspective, right? So when President Trump reversed that strategy and he sent Zal Khalilzad, an ambassador, to essentially to surrender to the Taliban, that's when we began to actually actively partner with the Taliban against the Afghan government. It is a stain on our history that's going to take a long time to overcome. Now, what do you mean? How could we be partnering with the Taliban against the Afghan government? Think about what we did. We talked to those jackasses, the Taliban, in Doha, Qatar, without the Afghan government, humiliating the Afghan government, right? Diminishing their influence. What else did we do? We listed for the Taliban all the things we wouldn't do, and we reduced our intelligence support. And for us to target actively the Taliban, we went back to the Obama period of time when we had to see hostile intent first. You couldn't actively go after the enemy until they had direct contact with, typically with Afghan forces. And then our air power was pulled back. We canceled our maintenance contracts. We forced them to release 15,000 of the most heinous criminals on earth during this period of time. So, I mean, we threw Afghanistan under the bus on our way out, I mean, even the Obama administration, when they said they're going to get completely out of Iraq in 2010, they didn't negotiate with Al-Qaeda on their way out, right? Why the hell didn't we just leave if we were going to leave? So I would say that our failure in Afghanistan was a self-defeat and a humiliation and really an astounding, abandonment. And there were a lot of reasons why this happened. I called somebody who was still senior in the administration, the Trump administration, and I just said, "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" And what I got back was a complaint about President Ashraf Ghani, and I said, "Hey, do you prefer Hibatullah Akhundzada? Is that who you prefer?" Right? And then what the Biden administration did was horrible. I mean, they flew the pride flag over the U.S. embassy during Pride Month, and then consigned all the Afghans to hell in the way they left it. But then they said, well, we had to abide because it was a Trump policy. Well, Trump was securing the border. They decided they didn't want to secure the border anymore. Trump was putting pressure on Iran. They decided, well, no, we should alleviate pressure on Iran. Trump had sanctioned the Houthis, and they said, no, we're going to undesignate them. We had put pressure on Maduro, and they said, oh, no, we think we can make Maduro into a Democrat. I mean, they reversed every other Trump policy, but they couldn't reverse that one. So anyway, sorry to go on about it, but I would say that, we had already won the war in Afghanistan. We had, what if we had 10,000 troops there? Nobody would even notice that. And the support was about $22 billion a year, okay? Nothing really, So and I could go on about that. You can tell you kind of hit a nerve there. Yes.
General McMaster, thanks so much for speaking with us today, and thank you for your service as well. I wanted to ask, this has been an incredible talk about America's kind of strategic history, and I wanted to ask, what do you think is America's greatest strategic failure in the 21st century, and what do you think was America's greatest strategic missed opportunity where it could have acted but didn't?
Okay, all right. Okay, well, there are a number of examples. I would say that because the biggest failure is associated with multiple administrations, and it has to do with the mantra of disengaging from the Middle East, right? That, seeing the Middle East as just a mess to be avoided, right? And this is across multiple administrations, right? The Obama administration essentially defined its foreign policy based on President Obama's opposition to the Iraq War, saw everything through that lens. And so what happened as a result of that? Actually, in the Obama administration's efforts to avoid what they perceived as the mistakes of the George W. Bush administration, they actually exceeded those mistakes. They exceeded them in Libya. Oh, we're not going to get mired in Libya, but we're going to change the regime. Look at Libya today. Libya is a country that's vast, but it only has 6 million people. What if we had done something, anything, to shape the political outcome there? Maybe we wouldn't have the hell that's in Libya today. Maybe the migration crisis in Europe wouldn't be as great. How about the Syrian civil war? To avoid the mistakes of the Obama administration, or the Bush administration, the Obama administration did not enforce the red line against Syria after the mass murder attacks in 2013, 2014. What happened as a result of that? I believe you had an acceleration of the civil war. You had Assad, who was on the ropes, get picked up off the ropes by the Russians, who we invited into Syria to verify that they were dismantling their chemical weapons. How did that work out? It's crazy, right? Then that allowed Iran to accelerate the cycle of sectarian conflict in the region. I could go on about so many different examples, but I think these had other geostrategic effects as well. For example, I think you draw a direct line from the unenforced red line in Syria to the invasion of Ukraine in 2014. I think there's a direct line there. I think there's a direct line between the unenforced red line in Syria and the Chinese building islands and weaponizing those islands in the South China Sea. So I think that the biggest mistake has been regionally there, but overall, a failure to recognize across multiple administrations that what is provocative is the perception of weakness. In this mantra today, after the Iranians fire 500 UASs and missiles at Israel, what's our advice to Israel? Take the win? Really? Take the win? Everything you hear is de-escalation, right? We need to de-escalate. We need to lower the temperature. This mantra of de-escalation essentially has given Iran the license to escalate on their own terms with impunity and continue to pursue its strategy of expending every Arab and Palestinian life in its quest to subjugate the Middle East, its neighbors, and to destroy Israel. So I think, if there's a thematic failure to go along with the kind of the geostrategic failure of disengage. Now, we're not going to conciliate the Middle East furies, right? We're not going to solve the Middle East problems. But, actually disengagement from the Middle East, things can get worse if we do that, right? You always think things can't get worse in the Middle East. Well, I think what we're seeing today, heck yes, they can get worse. And by the way, the Middle East does not adhere to Las Vegas rules, right? What happens there doesn't stay there, okay? Anyway, I think the Middle East and then this overall failure to recognize that it's the perception of weakness is provocative. Thanks. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.